Chosen one, stop for a moment. Before you continue with anything else today, listen carefully to this message, because there are moments in life when nothing appears to be changing on the outside, yet everything is being rearranged behind the scenes. You may be looking at your bank account and thinking, how can my financial story ever change? You may be looking at the bills, the responsibilities, the things you need, the things you wanted to accomplish, and the opportunities that seem to disappear just when you needed them most. Maybe you have worked hard. Maybe you have tried again and again. Maybe you have watched other people move forward while you felt like you were standing in the same place. And perhaps the hardest part was not even the lack of money. Perhaps the hardest part was the feeling that your life was not moving. You prayed, you waited, you hoped, and then you wondered whether anything was actually happening. But chosen one, what if this season was never meant to be your final story? What if the chapter you are living through right now is only the chapter before the turning point? Imagine a person standing at the edge of a long road. For years, that person has been walking, sometimes confidently, sometimes exhausted, sometimes with nothing but faith. There were days when the road looked completely empty. No signs, no opportunities, no evidence that anything was coming. And one night, after another disappointing day, that person finally sat down and whispered, "God, I don't understand anymore." That person was not asking for luxury. They were not asking to become better than everyone else. They simply wanted breathing room. They wanted to stop worrying about every expense. They wanted to help their family without feeling afraid. They wanted to wake up without immediately thinking about money. They wanted a chance, and perhaps you know exactly what that feels like. Now imagine that same person looking at the road and thinking the road has ended, but what they cannot see is that the road continues around the corner. The problem is not that there is no road. The problem is that they cannot see beyond the bend. That is where many people are in their financial lives. They mistake what they can see for everything that exists. They look at today's circumstances and use them to predict tomorrow. But tomorrow has not happened yet. Your current financial situation is a chapter. It is not necessarily the conclusion. And this is where your story begins to change. Because before financial change happens externally, something often begins changing internally. Your thinking changes, your patience changes, your ability to recognize opportunities changes, your understanding of money changes, your discipline changes, your confidence changes. And sometimes the greatest preparation happens during the season when you feel like absolutely nothing is happening. Think about everything you have learned during difficult seasons. You learned who was genuinely there for you. You learned which opportunities were real and which ones were only attractive on the surface. You learned that quick promises do not always lead to lasting results. You learned that desperation can make people accept things they would normally reject. You learned that not every open door is the right door. And perhaps most importantly, you learned how badly you wanted your life to change. That desire matters. But desire alone is not enough. You also need wisdom. You need patience. You need the courage to recognize the right opportunity when it appears. Because imagine receiving an opportunity, but being too afraid to take the first step. Imagine receiving a chance, but not having the discipline to follow through. Imagine receiving more money, but having the same habits that created the previous financial struggle. More money alone does not automatically create a better financial life. A changed story requires a changed approach. And perhaps this is why your journey has taken longer than you expected. Not because you were forgotten, not because your prayers were meaningless, but because the person who walks into the next chapter must be stronger than the person who entered the previous one. Chosen one, there is something else you need to understand. You cannot measure your entire future by one difficult season. A bad month is not a bad life. A financial setback is not a permanent identity. A closed door is not proof that every door is closed. And a delay is not automatically a denial. Sometimes you are standing closer to change than you realize, but because you have been looking at the same circumstances for so long, you cannot recognize how close you are. This is where our story returns to that person standing beside the road. For years, they had been asking for a breakthrough. One evening, they received a small opportunity. It was not the giant miracle they had imagined. It was not a suitcase full of money. It was not an instant transformation. It was simply an opportunity to do something different. At first, they almost ignored it. Why? Because they had become so accustomed to disappointment that hope itself felt dangerous. They thought, what if I try again and it doesn't work? But then they remembered something. Every previous disappointment had taught them something. The first failure taught them patience, the second taught them preparation, the third taught them to stop trusting every promise, the fourth taught them to become more disciplined, and suddenly, they realized something powerful. They were not the same person who had failed before. They had changed, so they took the first step, and that first step did not immediately make them wealthy, but it changed the direction of their story. That is important, because sometimes we expect transformation to begin with a huge event. But transformation can begin with one decision, one conversation, one skill, one opportunity, one habit, one courageous step, one moment when you decide that your circumstances will no longer dictate your entire mindset. Chosen one, perhaps your next chapter begins in a similar way, not with something dramatic, not with something that everyone else can immediately see, but with something small that becomes significant because you choose to act wisely. So if you have been feeling discouraged about your financial life, don't let today's numbers convince you that your future has already been written. Your future requires decisions you have not made yet, opportunities you have not seen yet, people you have not met yet, skills you have not developed yet, and possibilities you cannot currently imagine. Your story is still moving, and this is only the beginning. Stay with me, because in the next part, we are going deeper into the question that has been following you for so long. Why did the financial breakthrough take so long? Why did some doors close? Why did certain opportunities disappear? And what if some of those disappointments were actually preparing you for something better? Chosen one, remember the person we were talking about. They had been walking that long road for years. They had prayed, they had struggled, they had watched opportunities disappear. And then, finally, one small opportunity appeared. But the story did not suddenly become perfect. In fact, the next stage was difficult. The opportunity required patience. It required learning. It required mistakes. It required showing up even when there was no immediate reward. And that is where many people quit, because they expect a breakthrough to feel like a celebration from the first day. But sometimes the beginning of a new financial chapter looks completely ordinary. You may have to learn something. You may have to start small. You may have to become consistent. You may have to stop spending energy trying to impress people. You may have to stop comparing your progress to someone else's. You may have to understand that financial growth is often built quietly. The person in our story began learning. Every morning they spent time improving the skill connected to their new opportunity. At first, they were not very good. They made mistakes. They doubted themselves. Sometimes they wondered whether they had made the wrong decision. But instead of quitting, they asked a different question. What can I learn from this? That question changed everything, because when you ask, why is this happening to me? You may remain trapped inside frustration, but when you ask, what is this teaching me? You begin looking for direction, and direction matters. You see, chosen one, your financial story is not only about how much money you have, it is also about your relationship with money. Do you fear it? Do you chase it? Do you waste it? Do you respect it? Do you understand it? Do you know how to save? Do you know how to make careful decisions? Do you know how to say no? Do you know how to wait? These questions matter because a financial breakthrough without financial wisdom can disappear just as quickly as it arrived. That is why preparation is important. Imagine giving a person a powerful vehicle without teaching them how to control it. The power itself is not the problem. The lack of preparation is. The same principle can apply to financial opportunities. The goal is not simply to receive more. The goal is to become capable of handling more responsibly. The person in our story began to understand this. They stopped dreaming only about a huge amount of money. Instead, they started building. They saved what they could. They learned what they didn't know. They became more careful about who they trusted. They stopped saying yes to every attractive promise. And something interesting happened. The more disciplined they became, the more clearly they could recognize opportunities. One opportunity came from a person they had almost never noticed before. Another came through a skill they had been practicing quietly. Another came because someone remembered how dependable they had become. None of these opportunities looked like miracles, but together they started changing the direction of the story. And this is where you need to pay attention. Sometimes we are waiting for one enormous event when our breakthrough may arrive through a series of smaller doors. One door teaches you, another door connects you, another door gives you experience, another door gives you confidence, another door creates income, and eventually you look back and realize, I thought nothing was happening. Everything was happening. That realization can be powerful, Because you may be in that exact stage right now. You may be looking at your life and saying, nothing is changing. But perhaps things are changing in ways you cannot yet measure. Your knowledge is increasing, your awareness is increasing, your courage is increasing, your ability to recognize bad decisions is increasing, your understanding of yourself is increasing. And these changes can become the foundation for the next chapter. Now, there was one moment in our story when the person nearly gave up. They had worked for weeks, they had made progress, but then something went wrong. The opportunity they had been counting on suddenly became uncertain, and once again, fear returned. They thought, maybe I was wrong. Maybe nothing is going to change. Maybe this is just another disappointment. That night they sat alone and looked at everything they had been trying to build. For a few minutes they considered walking away, but then they remembered how far they had already come. They realized something. The goal was never to create a perfect journey. The goal was to keep moving. So instead of quitting, they adjusted. They learned from the setback. They changed their approach. They asked for advice. They became even more careful, and slowly the situation began improving again. Chosen one, this is why I want you to hear this part carefully. Do not confuse a setback with the end of your story. You can experience a setback and still be moving forward. You can make a mistake and still learn something valuable. You can lose an opportunity and still discover a better one. You can have a difficult financial month and still build a stronger financial future. Your story is bigger than one moment. The person in our story eventually reached a point where they had enough stability to breathe. Not unlimited wealth, not perfection, just stability. And that was a major victory. For the first time in years, they were not living entirely from fear. They could think, they could plan, they could look ahead. And when your mind is no longer consumed by constant panic, you can often make better decisions. That is another lesson. Sometimes the first financial breakthrough is not becoming rich. Sometimes it is gaining enough stability to make wise choices. Sometimes it is paying something you have been worried about. Sometimes it is finding reliable work. Sometimes it is learning a valuable skill. Sometimes it is discovering a new path. Sometimes it is simply escaping the cycle of making desperate decisions. Never underestimate those victories, because small victories can become foundations, and foundations are what hold larger structures. The person in our story kept building. Months passed, their situation improved, but there was still one thing missing. They had changed their habits, they had gained knowledge, they had developed discipline, but they still had not fully changed the way they saw themselves. Deep inside, they still believed they were the person who always struggled. They still expected things to go wrong. They still felt uncomfortable imagining a better future. And that became the next battle. Not with money, with identity. Because sometimes your circumstances improve before your mindset catches up. And that is where part 3 begins. Because the person who had spent years surviving was about to learn how to start building. And when that happened, the financial story began changing in a way they never expected. Chosen one, this is where the story becomes different. Remember the person who had spent years struggling? They had finally developed discipline. They had learned from failure. They had become more careful. They had started creating stability. But deep inside, they were still carrying the identity of someone who expected to lose. Every time something good happened, they waited for it to disappear. Every time they made progress, they worried about going backward. Every time an opportunity appeared, they thought, what if this doesn't work? That mindset had protected them during difficult years, but now it was becoming a limitation. Because you cannot build a new future while constantly expecting the old future to return. One morning, something happened that seemed ordinary. They received a message. It was from someone connected to the work they had been doing. The message contained an opportunity, a bigger opportunity, but it came with responsibility. It required them to make a decision. The old version of themselves immediately became afraid. They thought about all the things that could go wrong. But the person they had become during the previous months asked a different question. What would I need to learn to handle this responsibly? That question changed the entire conversation. Instead of running away from the opportunity, they studied it. They asked questions. They checked the details. They refused to make a rush decision. And finally, they said yes. Not because they were guaranteed success, but because they had learned how to move forward with wisdom. That distinction matters. Faith does not mean ignoring reality. Faith does not mean making reckless financial decisions. Faith can exist alongside wisdom, planning, patience, and responsibility. And that is the message I want you to remember. If you are praying for financial change, don't only pray for money, pray for wisdom. Pray for discipline. Pray for the ability to recognize good opportunities. Pray for the courage to reject harmful ones. Pray for patience. Pray for understanding. Pray for the ability to use what you receive responsibly. Because the greatest change may not simply be what comes into your hands. It may be what changes inside your mind. The opportunity worked, not perfectly. There were challenges, there were long days, there were moments of uncertainty, but the person kept going. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Their income began becoming more stable, their savings began growing, their confidence increased. But perhaps the biggest change was that they stopped seeing themselves as powerless. They realized they could learn, they could improve, they could make decisions, they could recover from mistakes, they could build. And that realization was worth more than any single payment. Because once you believe you can build, you stop waiting for someone else to rescue you. You begin participating in your own transformation. Now I want you to imagine yourself in this story, not as someone waiting for a magical number to appear, but as someone standing at a crossroads. One road says, "Nothing will ever change." The other says, "I don't know exactly how it will change, but I am willing to learn, grow, and move wisely." Which road are you choosing? Because your answer matters. You may not control everything that happens around you, but you can control what you learn. You can control whether you prepare. You can control whether you waste every opportunity. You can control whether you keep improving. You can control whether you allow fear to make every decision. And these choices compound. One good decision may seem small, but another good decision follows, then another, and eventually the direction of your life changes. This is what happened to the person in our story. They began with almost nothing, but they stopped thinking like someone who had nothing. They began thinking like someone who was building something. That did not mean pretending to be wealthy. It meant becoming responsible. They stopped spending to impress people. They stopped comparing their life to people online. They stopped believing every easy money promise. They became comfortable saying, "I don't know yet. I need to learn. I need to think about it. I need to check the details." Those sentences protected them. And then another opportunity appeared. This one was bigger. It had the potential to change their financial situation significantly. But there was a problem. They had to decide whether to take a risk. The old version of themselves would have either jumped immediately because of desperation or rejected it immediately because of fear. The new version did neither. They investigated, they calculated, they considered the downside. They sought appropriate advice, they gave themselves time, and finally, they made a decision. That is maturity. That is growth. That is how a financial story changes sustainably. Not through blind excitement, not through desperation, but through informed courage. And something began happening that the person could not have predicted years earlier. The things they once prayed for began appearing in different forms, not necessarily exactly how they imagined, but in ways that made sense. An opportunity, a connection, a skill, a better decision, a new source of income, a chance to solve an old problem, a chance to help someone else, a chance to create something. One thing connected to another, and suddenly the road that once looked empty was filled with possibilities. They looked backward and realized why the earlier seasons mattered. If they had received everything too early, they might not have known how to handle it. If every door had opened, they might have entered the wrong ones. If every opportunity had worked, they might never have learned discernment. If they had never experienced financial pressure, they might never have developed discipline. The delay had not been comfortable, but it had taught them. And now they could finally understand the difference between waiting and preparing. Waiting says, "Something should happen." Preparing says, "When it happens, I want to be ready." Chosen one, that is your invitation. Don't spend all your energy asking when the breakthrough will come. Ask yourself, who am I becoming while I wait? What skill can you improve? What financial habit can you change? What knowledge can you gain? What unnecessary expense can you reconsider? What opportunity can you investigate? What fear can you stop allowing to control you? What wise step can you take this week? Because your financial story can change one decision at a time. And sometimes, the door you are asking for will only become useful after you become ready to walk through it. The person in our story had reached that point. They were ready. And then came the moment they had been waiting for. A major opportunity appeared. It was not a guarantee. It was not a promise of instant wealth. But it was real. It was something they could build upon. They looked at the opportunity. They remembered the years of struggle. They remembered the nights when they thought nothing would ever change. And for the first time, they smiled. Not because everything was finished, but because they finally understood. The story had been changing all along, and now they could see it. Chosen one, we have reached the final part of this story. But remember something. The real ending is not about a magical amount of money. It is about transformation. The person we have been following did not wake up one morning and suddenly become a completely different human being. Their life changed through hundreds of small decisions. They learned, they failed, they adjusted, they became disciplined. They stopped making decisions from desperation. They learned to recognize opportunities. They became more patient. They became more responsible. And eventually, their financial situation began reflecting the person they had become. One morning, they sat down and looked at their finances. For the first time, they were not overwhelmed. They had plans. They had savings. They had goals. They had learned how to manage what they had. And then they remembered the person they used to be. The person who once sat beside the road and wondered whether life would ever change. That person had not disappeared. That person had grown. And that is what I want you to understand about your own story. You don't need to become someone else. You need to become a stronger, wiser version of yourself. Your financial story can change. But don't define that change only by becoming a millionaire. Define it by becoming financially wiser. Define it by becoming more disciplined. Define it by creating opportunities instead of only waiting for them. Define it by making decisions that your future self will thank you for. Define it by learning how money works. Define it by refusing to let temporary circumstances determine your permanent identity. And most importantly, don't let the desire for financial freedom make you vulnerable to people promising instant wealth. There will always be someone saying, "Give me your money and I'll double it. Do this and you'll become rich overnight." There's no risk. Everyone is making money. Be careful. A true financial breakthrough does not require you to abandon wisdom. If something sounds too good to be true, slow down, investigate, ask questions, seek qualified advice when needed. Protect what you already have while building what comes next. Because wealth is not only about making money, it is also about keeping your judgment. And chosen one, maybe that is one of the biggest lessons hidden inside this entire message. You have been asking for a changed financial story, but perhaps you are also being prepared to handle that changed story. You don't want an opportunity that destroys your peace. You don't want money that creates problems you cannot manage. You don't want success that costs you everything meaningful. You want a life that becomes stronger from the inside out. That is why patience matters. That is why wisdom matters. That is why discipline matters. And that is why your current chapter does not have to determine your final chapter. Think about the road again. The road looked empty. The person thought it had ended. But the road continued beyond the bend. The bend represented everything they could not yet see. The opportunity, the lesson, the connection, the skill, the growth, the new direction. And perhaps your life has a bend too. You cannot see around it yet. You don't know exactly who you will meet. You don't know exactly what opportunity will appear. You don't know which skill will become valuable. You don't know which decision will open another door. But you can prepare. You can learn. You can stay alert. You can remain wise. You can continue moving. And you can refuse to let temporary disappointment convince you that your story is finished. Chosen one, if you have been waiting for a sign that you should not give up, let this be your reminder. You are not required to understand the entire road today. You only need to take the next wise step, one step, then another, and eventually you may look back and realize that the distance between your old life and your new life was created by thousands of small choices. Maybe your breakthrough begins with learning a skill. Maybe it begins with creating a plan. Maybe it begins with stopping an unhealthy financial habit. Maybe it begins with applying for an opportunity. Maybe it begins with starting something small. Maybe it begins with asking for guidance. Maybe it begins with finally believing that your circumstances are changeable. Whatever that next step is, don't ignore it. Because sometimes the door you have been praying about doesn't look like a door. It looks like work. It looks like learning. It looks like patience. It looks like a small opportunity. It looks like starting again. It looks like saying no. It looks like waiting. It looks like trying one more time. And that's why you have to stay awake, not desperate. Awake, not reckless. Wise, not obsessed with money. Focused on growth. Because your financial story is not simply about what you receive. It is about what you become capable of creating, managing, protecting, and sharing. And there is another beautiful part of this story. When the person finally reached a place of greater stability, they remembered the people who had helped them during their difficult years. They remembered the kindness. They remembered the encouragement. They remembered the people who believed in them when they did not believe in themselves. And they decided that their future would not only be about themselves. They wanted their success to become useful. They wanted to help their family. They wanted to support people who had once been where they were. They wanted their financial improvement to create something meaningful. And that is the difference between simply having money and having purpose. Money can become a tool for stability, a tool for opportunity, a tool for generosity, a tool for building, a tool for helping. But never allow money to become your identity. You are more than your bank account. Your worth is not determined by how much you have. And your difficult season does not make you less valuable. If you are struggling financially right now, don't hate yourself for being where you are. Learn, plan, ask for help when appropriate, take responsible steps, and keep moving. Because the person in our story once believed they were trapped forever. They weren't. Their life changed. Not overnight. But it changed. And your life can change too. Not because someone can guarantee a specific amount of money or promise that a miracle will arrive on a particular day, but because human beings can learn, adapt, build, and make different decisions. And because faith can give you the courage to keep moving when you cannot yet see the entire path. So, chosen one, hear this final message clearly. Do not look at your current financial situation and declare that this is where your story ends. You are still learning, you are still growing, you are still becoming. There are opportunities you have not encountered. There are lessons you have not learned. There are people you have not met. There are decisions you have not made. There are chapters you have not read. Your story is not finished. And maybe the financial change you have been hoping for will not arrive in the exact form you imagined. Maybe it will come through a skill. Maybe through an opportunity. Maybe through discipline. Maybe through a new direction. Maybe through a door you almost ignored. But when that moment comes, be ready. Be wise. Be patient. Do your homework. Don't rush. Don't allow excitement to replace judgment. And don't allow fear to replace courage. Remember the person beside the road. They thought the road had ended, but it hadn't. They simply couldn't see around the corner. And perhaps that's where you are right now. You are standing before a bend. You cannot see what is beyond it, but you can keep walking. You can prepare. You can grow. You can trust the process while still using wisdom. And one day, you may look back at this exact season and say, now I understand why I had to learn those lessons. Now I understand why that door closed. Now I understand why I had to become stronger. Now I understand why I couldn't see the next chapter. Because sometimes you only understand the beginning after you reach the other side. So don't give up on your future because your present is uncomfortable. Don't make desperate financial decisions because you are tired of waiting. Don't compare your journey to someone else's highlight reel. Don't believe every promise of instant wealth. Instead, become prepared, become disciplined, become knowledgeable, become patient, become courageous, and keep taking the next wise step. Your financial story can change, your habits can change, your opportunities can change, your knowledge can change, your direction can change. And when your direction changes, your destination can eventually change too. If this message spoke to you, I want you to write this in the comments. My financial story is changing. Not as a magical promise, not as a guarantee, but as a reminder to yourself that you are choosing growth instead of fear. You are choosing wisdom instead of desperation. You are choosing preparation instead of waiting passively. And you are choosing to believe that your current chapter does not have to be your final chapter. Chosen one, remember this. The road is still there. The story is still moving. The chapter is not finished. And the next page has not been written yet. So keep going, keep learning, keep building, keep praying, keep thinking wisely. Keep your heart grounded. Keep your eyes open. Because sometimes the biggest change in your life begins with the smallest decision you make today. Your financial story is not finished. And the person you are becoming may be the very person capable of creating the future you have been hoping for. This is your reminder. This is your moment to prepare. This is your moment to stop believing that nothing can change. Because your story is still being written. And the next chapter can be different. Stay faithful. Stay wise. Stay prepared. And when the next door appears, be ready to recognize it. If you believe your story can change, subscribe to The Final Calling, turn on notifications, and stay with us for the next message. Because sometimes one message can change the way you see your entire journey. Your past is a chapter. Your present is a chapter. But your future is still being written. And this chapter is not the end.